Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. The Browns lose to Pittsburgh again. Kind of felt like a lot of the Browns-Steelers games versus Pittsburgh. The Browns did have the lead in this one early, but special teams, I think, story of the day, really didn't help you out. It's not like you got an overwhelming performance from the offense either or the defense, even though I would say if you were to line up all three of the sides of the ball here for the Cleveland Browns, the defense is probably the least responsible for all of this. They gave up 17 points on short fields that were handed to him. Jameis Winston interception led to 7 points. A bad punt by Corey Bojorquez led to 3 points, and I believe another Jameis Winston interception led to 7 points the other way. So yeah, the Browns defense gave up 27, but 17 of those really more about the lack of performance that you're getting from your offense than it is about what your defense is doing. Offensively, the Browns seemed outmatched here. I think the Steelers did a good job covering and getting pressure on the line of scrimmage. It really had Jameis Winston frazzled for like the first half of this game. Jameis had a bad game in this one. He made a couple of good throws in this game. And it brings me to kind of where I'm at with Jameis Winston, right? Because it seems like the fan base right now keeps going back and forth, right? Where it's like Jameis Winston throws for 500 yards. We love him. Sign him to a 2-year extension right now. He's so much better than Deshaun Watson. And then like Jameis has a game like this, or he has a game like he did against the Chargers. And, we're saying that we're worse off as far as being able to win with Jameis. Here's where I'm at with the Browns' future quarterback situation and where I think it's reasonable to be at. You don't have to marry yourself to Jameis Winston right now. I see no reason to marry yourself to Jameis Winston one way or the other, right? I don't think you should lock yourself into, no, don't bring him back, he sucks, or lock yourself into, yes, bring him back, he's the best option that you can get. Like, I think you should see what's available in the offseason. Whether that's Jameis being the best option to return, that's fine. You can get something out of Jameis. We've seen it over the last few weeks. Sometimes it's going to be good. Sometimes it's going to be bad. I think the Browns need to do things to mitigate that risk, right? I think they tried to in this one. They kept Jameis at 41 pass attempts, which is about where you want to keep Jameis, under 40. They ran the ball significantly more this week. They had more success running the ball this week. It's just Jameis did not have as good as a game this week as he had last week when it comes to accuracy. That's the next thing that you have to address with Jameis Winston, right? When I hear people say things like, hey, if you just cut down the interceptions with Jameis Winston, then he'll be fine. And people say that like it's an actual strategy or game plan that you can come up with. I just question how people get there. I've watched a lot of Jameis Winston film. I've watched the film of him in Tampa Bay. I've watched the film of him in New Orleans. I've watched the film of him in Cleveland. When you watch Jameis Winston, is there some of it that's like the interceptions, the bad throws that are because he's making a wild decision? Yeah, but it's not as big as a part of the sample as you would think. It's actually a very small chunk of what the interception problem is with Jameis Winston. Usually when Jameis makes these interceptions, it's not because he's making a bad decision. It's because he's not a consistently accurate passer of the football. So the interception where he was targeting Elijah Moore, that play was open. The Browns were in a 2-minute situation where they had to score in less than a minute after getting a turnover. That was the right decision to throw the ball to Elijah Moore, in my opinion, given the situation the Browns are in, given the look that the Steelers defense gave you. That was the right decision. Instead of giving him an accurate ball and laying that in and it being a big play, he overthrows him. It goes straight into James Pierre and it turns into an interception. when people say things like, if you just cut down the interceptions with Jameis Winston, the question is, how do you do that? Because if those interceptions were being created strictly because he makes bad decisions all the time, then I would say, hey, there's something you could do there, right? Especially if it was a young player doing it. I would agree. Like, you can cut down the interceptions. You can do that with coaching. I don't think you can fix Jameis Winston's interception problem with coaching or limiting his pass attempts, because it's more about whether he's going to be accurate enough to execute what he's seeing than it is about whether he's going to make the right decision or not. And I think that's the big thing. Like, you watch this game, Jameis made some decent decisions in this game. The ball just did not cooperate with him. He was not accurate throwing this football this week. Part of that is because he probably threw too much last week, 68 times on Monday Night Football, 58 times on Monday Night Football, probably bled into this week. I don't doubt that, but that's part of the course with Jameis. So going into next year, I think that's something to consider, right? Is Jameis Winston an option to bring back to potentially be a bridge? I think so. But you can't go into it thinking that you're going to cut down his interceptions, because the reason these interceptions happen don't seem to me to be something that can be coached out of a player. And if that were, it was up, Quincy from the editing room here. I just want to point out too, if you're going to have Jameis Winston play quarterback, you really can't also do things like have Kadarius Toney returning punts. Like, if you're going to take the high risk, high reward quarterback, you really need to minimize risk everywhere else. You can't have the running back that fumbles. You can't have the wide receiver that drops. You can't have the punt returner that don't be focusing. And when you do have that, you create a situation, and I think I posted this on Blue Sky, where it's like you're playing Russian roulette in football, because eventually one of those things, if not both of those things, are going to come get you. So if you're going to play Jameis ball, you got to understand that Jameis is going to always be an active threat to turn the ball over, which means you got to minimize every other variable. Like, that's the only way you could reduce interceptions, because again, his interceptions don't come strictly because he's making bad decisions. It's inaccuracy, and that can't be coached out of him. If he could become a more accurate passer, I'm pretty sure he would have already taken the steps to do so. He's had a 13-year career not 13-year career, but over a 10-year career in the league at this point. So I couldn't imagine that the accuracy thing is something he can easily fix. So if that's not going to be the case, you got to mitigate every other factor that could create a turnover. And having somebody like Kadarius Toney running punts, that is crazy reckless. Like, you cannot let that happen. And yes, that's on Bubba Ventrone, but Kevin, you got to sign off on that too. Like, at some point, somebody got to turn off the peanut gallery, right? I get it now. The team is a 3-win team. Okay, you're just trying stuff out at this point. I get it. But if they roll into next year with Kadarius Toney returning punts, I'm going to lose my mind, because why in the world is that appropriate at that point? But back to the main video, editing Quincy just wanted to jump in here and make that point. For the case, I feel like he would be somebody's starter. But I think the interceptions are part of the course with Jameis. So that being the case, I don't see any reason to marry yourself to him. Like, see what's out there. See who might be available. I think there could be better options available, depending on what the money is for certain people. But you don't have to be married to Jameis, but you don't have to also take a hard stance again. Like, basically, if you're a Browns fan and you're wondering about quarterback, the only hardline stance the fan base should really have about quarterback, in my opinion, is Deshaun Watson can't play next year as the starter. As long as Deshaun Watson's not the starter next year, I feel like they'll be in a fine enough place at quarterback to not be as disastrous as they were this year, especially at the beginning of the season. So that's kind of where I sit with this whole Jameis thing. I don't really see a reason to put DTR in at this point, too, because I don't think you're going to see anything better from him. And I don't think putting DTR in makes your wide receivers develop better. And I think that's more important than seeing if you got a quarterback in a 5th round pick. Like, the one thing Jameis Winston has been like objectively great for is the development of some of your wide receivers, especially your younger ones. We've seen this with Cedric Tillman. Jerry Jeudy had another nice night today where he had 5 receptions, 64 yards, and a touchdown. Like, Jameis Winston is helping you develop your wide receiver core right now. I think he's good for your offensive line because he navigates the pocket well. Putting in DTR sacrifices all of that, and the upside is figuring out what you have in a 5th round pick that hasn't really showed that much promise in regular season NFL games. So I don't see any need to go to him. We'll see what the team does going forward. Now that they're 3-10, I believe it's just a bad record. But I expect them to stay part of course with Jameis Winston for the rest of the season. Let's talk about special teams. Because if you're a Browns fan, another place where you should probably have a hardline stance is, for multiple reasons, Dustin Hopkins cannot be your only kicker next year. And neither should Bubba Ventrone be back. Both for separate reasons, right? I'm not going to blame Bubba Ventrone for Dustin Hopkins not making field goals anymore. That's not on him. Dustin Hopkins just, I don't know if he got it. Because you signed him to a contract, I don't mind the ideal of letting him roll into camp and just seeing what he looks like in camp next year. Maybe this was just a freaky off year for him and you can get a better season out of him next year. But if I'm the Browns, I'm scouting the spring leagues. I'm taking the best kicker from the spring leagues because the last 2 years, 2 good kickers have come from that league. Take the best kicker from the spring league, put him in a competition with Dustin Hopkins, and let the best kicker win next year. I understand why you're not going to fire him, and I understand why it wouldn't be the best strategic decision to fire him right now, given that, like, yeah, even if he costs the Browns a game or 2 going forward, it's not really the biggest deal in the world, given that the Browns are 3-10. But yeah, I could see the Browns really having to consider bringing in somebody, and they really should, and they absolutely can't go into next offseason with no real competition for Dustin Hopkins at the very least, right? If they want to cut him, I wouldn't be opposed to that, but you really got to have some competition at the very least. So that's where I'm at with Dustin. The reason I'm over the whole special teams coach experience. What are we doing putting Kadarius Toney back there returning punts? And I know what some people are going to say. Hey, up until he muffed the punt, he looked good. Yes, and you're correct, right? Kadarius Toney opened up this game. His first punt, he made a bad decision and then pinned the Browns back in the 10. And then he had 2 good punt returns, and then he muffed the punt. Here's my thing. Did them 13 yards he got on them punt returns really, were they more beneficial than having the ball at the end of the game? Y'all answer that question to me. I have said this for a while. I'll continue to say this. I don't know why the Browns think that Kadarius Toney would be a good punt returner. I don't know what gives them that idea. I can see how you can fool yourself into it, right? Because you can look at the 1 punt return he had in the NFL, in the Super Bowl, and then you can look at, his athletic ability and skill set and go, oh, this guy would be a great punt returner. But there's a reason Andy Reid refused to use this dude on punt team most of the time, even when he had success in the Kansas City Chiefs jersey. It's because this dude does stuff like catch the ball within the 5, like muff the punt at the end of the game. I didn't get this whole Kadarius Toney experiment. I have to imagine this is mainly a special teams thing. And Bubba Ventrone, I'm over the whole experience, right? We're not a good punt coverage team. We're not a good punt kick return coverage team. He's not done a good job. It's been like this for 3 years. I would prefer if they moved on from Bubba Ventrone and went a different direction. in the building. Maybe Bubba does other stuff that's more important than just the special teams responsibilities, and he doesn't get fired. But I don't see how that is the case, because all I see is evidence that Bubba Ventrone should be fired. Obviously the Browns aren't going to make a move at head coach. They shouldn't. I don't think they're going to make a move at GM. They've made that clear as well, and I don't think they should. But special teams coordinator, some of these pieces when it comes to the kick game, definitely got to change going forward here. Outside of that, I thought Nick Chubb had a very promising performance. I thought Jerome Ford was pretty good today too. Had a couple of really, really nice runs and a really good kick return. Nick Chubb, obviously, this is the closest to Nick Chubb he's looked like, and this is probably one of the better run defenses he's played. So I think that's encouraging if you're the Browns. 11 carries, 48 yards, 4.4 carry. So it's like significantly better than what Nick Chubb had been doing. Had a couple of plays where he got out in open space and accelerated. Like, looking close